In this presentation, I will bombard you with speculation concerning the Daedalus myth, as told by Ovid. My premise is that Ovid tried to make the best of a very complicated situation by weaving a simple narrative about a boy and his father. It is these complications I wish to introduce. Let's begin, though, with a summary of the myth and its background. By now you know the story of Daedalus and Icarus as told by Ovid. The father and son are imprisoned on Crete by King Minos. In order to escape, Daedalus, the master craftsman, whose name means cunningly wrought or brilliant, builds wings for himself and his son in order to escape. Icarus, not being the brightest star in the sky, doesn't listen when Dad tells him not to fly too close to the sun. His wings melt, and down he plummets into the sea. Ovid then adds the oddly interesting side story of Perdix and Talus, in which he hints that maybe Icarus's death is repayment for the death of Talus. He tells us that Talus was turned into a partridge, and partridges don't fly, again making his oblique connection between the flight of the father and the son. That's the story as we know it. Now a few details about the story behind the story. In one version of the myth, there's a struggle for power on Crete, during which Minos prays to Poseidon to send him a bull to sacrifice, hoping that an answer to this prayer will convince people he is to be king. Poseidon obliges, and a wondrous white bull emerges from the sea. All are convinced, and Minos is made king. But Minos' greed gets the better of him. He can't bear to sacrifice the beautiful bull, so he sacrifices a lesser one and keeps the bull for himself. Poseidon's revenge was to make Minos' wife, Pasiphae, fall madly in love with the bull. She desperately wants to have sex with the bull, but doesn't know how, so she contacts Daedalus, the artisan. He helps her by building a hollow cow with holes in all the right places. Pasiphae climbs in, Daedalus rolls the cow out into the field with the bull, and presto, 9 months later, Pasiphae gives birth to a bouncing baby man-bull, known as the Minotaur, which means Minos' bull. Not knowing what to do with the monster, Minos has Daedalus build a labyrinth in which to imprison him. To make a long story short, eventually Theseus arrives and, with the help of Ariadne, Minos' daughter, kills the Minotaur and then runs away with Ariadne, whom he abandons at the first port. In one of the many versions of this story, after Theseus leaves, the god Dionysus arrives, finds the abandoned Ariadne, and marries her. In another version, she hangs herself. Now, let's imagine that Ovid, collector of Greek myths, has come across a great number of fragments concerning Daedalus, Icarus, Minos, and so forth, and in order to make sense of all of the sometimes contradictory pieces, he weaves the narrative that we have read about the man and his son. He then adds the Perdix Talus story in order to make sense of some of the remaining loose strands. In other words, my claim is that Ovid gave us a nice, neat story, but underneath lies a confusing mass of clues which are impossible to make sense of. What I want to do now is engage in a bit of free association, topic by topic, in which I try to show some of the strands that Ovid was dealing with. Let's begin with Daedalus himself. Daedalus is best known as being a brilliant artisan. Remember that his name means brilliant one. You may also remember another individual with that appellation, known as Lucifer in the Bible, and often identified with the Greek demigod Prometheus, creator of humans under the auspices of Zeus, at least according to one story. The artisans of the ancient realm were most often blacksmiths, those who formed metal into objects. The god of the smiths, himself a famous artisan, was Hephaestus, son of Hera, known as Vulcan to the Romans. Is Daedalus an ancient reference to the smith god, or is Hephaestus to be identified with Icarus, or maybe all three are one and the same? Let's consider. Hephaestus, whose name means he who shines by day, was the son of Hera by a shadowy figure named Daedalus. This establishes Hephaestus as an ancient sun god who is probably demoted with the appearance of the Zeus cults. Myth has it that when his mother, along with others, rebelled against Zeus, Hephaestus helped her, and for his troubles, Zeus threw him out of heaven. He fell for several days. When he hit the ground, he was badly hurt and was nursed back to health with the help of the goddess Daedalus, but forever after he limped. Indeed, he is known as the lame god. In the Iliad, when Thetis goes to see Hephaestus to ask him to make new armor for her son Achilles, he is shown limping around his workshop, making automatons, robots to wait on the gods. So, Hephaestus is the smith god, and he limps. There's an interesting tradition that in ancient times blacksmiths were lame. We've already seen that poets were blind, but blacksmiths were lame evidently for another reason. They didn't begin lame, but were purposefully lamed. The reason is that blacksmiths were so valuable to a village that they couldn't afford to be lost. So by laming their smiths, villages made it more difficult for them to leave. Just to complicate the picture, we might add also that tradition tells us that smiths were often tattooed on the forehead with a sun emblem. Remember that Hephaestus was a sun god. This may have led to the tradition of the Cyclops having an eye in the middle of their forehead. The Cyclops were famous as Zeus's smiths, the ones who made his lightning bolts. So, smiths are portrayed as lame. Hold that thought. Hephaestus, oddly enough, was said to be married to Aphrodite, goddess of sexual desire. This is an odd match, but that aside, what interests me is that the partridge was Aphrodite's sacred bird. We already know that partridges don't fly very high, but another interesting fact is that the cock partridge hobbles or limps when performing a love dance, holding one heel ready to strike at rivals. Robert Graves tells us that in the spring, villagers performed an erotic partridge dance in honor of the moon goddess, and that the male dancers hobbled and wore wings. This dance was supposedly performed on a mosaic floor etched with a labyrinth. So Hephaestus was related symbolically to the partridge both through the limp and through his marriage to Aphrodite. But there's more. To trap a partridge, a contraption was used in which the bird was enticed inside, but then could not see how to exit. A labyrinth. More on labyrinths in a bit.